Rose Hawthorne was the youngest of 3 children of Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne. She grew up in a very loving home. She has an interesting religious background because her father was into transcendentalism and her mother was kind of several different things. There was a lot of Unitarian influence, but the Unitarian branch at that time that was actually kind of leaning towards Trinitarianism. So her mother has a very strong devotion to the person of Christ. She has some beautiful letters about this. And she grew up in a very happy home by all accounts. But her father died the day before her 13th birthday. And that changed a lot. They moved to Dresden, Germany, because it was cheaper to live over there. There was kind of an American community there. And they lived there for several years, and then they moved to England when the Franco-Prussian War started. I think that's the right war. And her mother died in England, and then her brother had sent a man named George Lathrop to come and pick up her and her older sister Una, and instead he came and he married Rose. They were married in, I think, an Anglican church. And then Una stayed in England and died in England. And so she came home married. She was 20, he was 19. Neither family was happy about it. They really did love each other. They had a very, they loved each other very much. It was probably an immature love, but, and a lot of strong personality in that marriage. But he was trying to make it as a writer, probably very difficult as the son-in-law of Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of the most famous American writers in history. And she tried writing as well. So they had a marriage that was not what they both would have wanted, I think, in the end. There's a lot of indications from family letters and other sources, including the oral tradition of the community, that George had a drinking problem later in their marriage. They did have one child, Francie, but he also died when he was 5 years old of I think scarlet fever, and that was just such a tragic loss for both of them. It really they both had a very difficult time with that. They moved around a lot. Eventually, it's sort of a mystery how they really ended up in the Catholic Church, because George wrote some public apologetics about it, defending their choice. And they had Catholic friends. We think that's probably where they heard about it first, and that they started reading. So it seems like it was very much an intellectual impetus to the conversion. But what we can see from Rose Hawthorne's journal entries after she converted was that she found a faith that satisfied both her heart and her mind in a way that she hadn't found anything before. Her letters as a teenager, she's extremely judgmental about preaching. So very strong opinions about like how boring the sermon was, or like why did we get this guy to stand up here and say. She had strong opinions about that kind of thing, and she jumped right into the devotional life of the church, which is very much a part of the church at that time. This was in the late 19th century, and just found a place for her whole self. And once she converted, she also, you see this kind of this nagging desire to be useful, to find a way to serve. And she and her husband, they wrote a book together about the Georgetown Visitation Sisters. They taught Catholic Sunday schools. Rose did some different speaking for some different Catholic groups or Catholic women's groups, but none of it was like quite right. Eventually, she and George separated with the permission of the bishop. She's a very strong-willed person, and there's a beautiful letter where she says, "I'll do whatever the bishop tells me. Like, I don't feel safe living with George," and also, I think the most touching part is a real concern for his soul, that them living together was not helping him, and that it was not good for his salvation. So there was like that real attentiveness to the other there, and also a willingness to obey. And the bishop did give her permission to live apart from them. They separated. They never divorced or anything. They were married till he died. And once that happened, she went on a long retreat and she began thinking about ways to serve, what she could do. She heard a story, if I remember correctly, from a Paulist father, that about a young seamstress who had gotten cancer, which was widely thought in both the public and the medical fields to be contagious at the time. She had gotten cancer and been sent to this place called Blackwell's Island, which was sort of city run, but it had an insane asylum, it had a poorhouse, it had an incurables hospital, but essentially people were just sent out there to die. There was nothing much done for them once they got there. She heard this story and she contrasted it with the story of her friend Emma Lazarus, who is the poetess who wrote the inscription on the Statue of Liberty base. That's part of her poem, The Colossus. And Emma also died of cancer, but surrounded by the best medical care that a family could afford, and loving friends, loving family. So she died in as much comfort as was possible, whereas this other young woman was just cast out on the street with no one to care for her. And she writes that in hearing that story, a fire was lighted in her heart and it's never gone out. So she took a 3-month nursing course at the New York Cancer Hospital, which became what is now Sloan Kettering. And she had no nursing experience at all. And she took that course and she rented a tenement apartment on the Lower East Side of New York, which was one of the worst parts of New York, overcrowded. At that time, there's one history book one of my sisters read that it was the most densely populated place on earth, probably, just because the number of immigrants flooding into that area. And then they all lived in these little tiny apartments. She moved into that. She wanted to live with the poor and serve with them and not go home to a nicer apartment. So she did, and all of her friends thought she was crazy, very concerned about her. She moved in, she painted it yellow to make it more cheerful, and she started taking in cancer patients, and she also started going out to different people. So initially she went out and made house calls as well as bringing people in to live with her. And that's what she did for the rest of her life. So she started doing that in 1896, and then she did it until she died in 1926. It was important for her to have Christ at the center of it. It's always been a Christocentric work, where you meet the suffering Christ and then also are Christ to this person who is suffering. It was extremely important to her that they live with us, that they're part of the life. Her husband died in 1898, and once that happened, she pursued a more religious form of life. She also finally, in 1897, was joined by a woman named Alice Huber, who's our co-foundress. Alice is great because she was cradle Catholic. Her father was a doctor, and she did not like being around sick people at all. But she was so taken by Rose Hawthorne. She said she was the only lovely thing, this mass of awfulness when she first visited. So she began coming 1 day a week, and then she thought, well, I'll come 2 days a week because you really need help, and then 3 days a week. And then by March of 1898, she had joined Mother full-time. And they're totally opposite personalities, and I love that there's this deep friendship at the base of the community. That's where our community started, was this deep Christ-centered friendship between these two women. And eventually the work expanded. We were able to build a home in New York. That got overcrowded, and Mother wanted to begin, Mother Alphonsa became her religious name. She wanted to take male patients as well. They couldn't in the quarters that they were in, so then they bought the property up at Rosary Hill, where our Mother house is now, from the French Dominicans who had lived there when they had to leave France because of the revolution and were going back. So they sold it to Mother, and we've been there since 1901, doing exactly the same thing. So we bring people who can't afford their care to live with us until they die. And that's all we do. That's our one apostolate. But they are part of our life to the extent that is possible. And what is at the base of our life is always prayer, so liturgical prayer and personal prayer, the Eucharist, which has been an important part of the community since the beginning. Mother wrote down whenever she received Holy Communion, she would note it in her journal. She has a whole entry about the first time that the Lord is in the tabernacle, in the house, what a difference it made to the people we serve and to the sisters. First Friday adoration all day. It's always there through all the writings. And so Eucharistic devotion and this devotion to doing hands-on care, that's always going to be kind of at the center of who we are and what we do. And I think ultimately the faith in the resurrection, and people ask, like, how are you all so joyful? It's because this isn't the end, and that have the privilege of being with people who may not have gotten to hear or see or experience the love of God in a particularly tangible way throughout their lives, and to be that kind of last-ditch effort by the Lord to know Him and to have even the smallest opportunity to say yes when He calls you home. I mean, that's a huge privilege. It's a huge responsibility as well. It calls us forward in our faith, but it's wonderful. And by staying faithful to our charism, we've been able to continue to do that. So, because we also don't take any money from our patients or their families, it's all free for them, and we're all we're held up by just voluntary donations. So we don't fundraise, we don't go out and beg, and we don't accept money from patients or the families. So Mother said it's the Lord's work, and if He wants it to continue, it will. So, and He has, so we're very grateful. I think founders' stories are always sort of intimidating because it just seems like this huge thing that somebody did, and it's like, wow, that seems so far beyond most of us. But I love Mother's story of sort of living like a normal life and doing her best to make that work, and then conversion, and finding that after conversion she had this hunger that was like even more so than before. And it always shows me that it matters so much when people say yes to the things along the way. And the things that she said yes to weren't easy. I think, she came into the church with her husband, they came in together, but then that didn't work out the way that either of them had hoped. And she continued to say yes to each step along the way. I think that's the other thing about her story that I love, is that you get to see pretty concretely that it was a yes at each different step. It wasn't just one yes and then you're done and you're in and everything's good. But that it matters so much that she said yes, because not only, it's not a numbers game, right? But not only like the number of people that are served or the number of sisters that have, found their life and joy and hopefully salvation through the work, but that it's something more than that. It's something about making the church more herself, right? Like that Christ grow in the full stature that St. Paul talks about, where the church becomes more what the church truly is with every yes, right? With every yes to conversion, to vocation, to daily moments of ordinary choices. That all builds up the life of the whole church. And so she was never just serving, her yes never just served like the person in front of her, although that was extremely important. It served the whole church, right? So we pray not just for our personal patients who are dying, but for all the dying, right? There's a hope of salvation that extends far beyond the room that you're working in, although that's the most personal contact with it. And her yes allows all the subsequent yeses to come along, right? If she had never said yes, I would never have had this life to say yes to either. And so it all matters. I mean, it's not about limiting God and saying, well, He couldn't have brought me into the church without this certain person, this certain deacon, or He couldn't have made me holy if I wasn't a Dominican sister of Hawthorne. That's not the point. The point is that there was a way that in His providence was going to be the best. And if somebody says no, can He work around that? Of course. He's God, He can do whatever He wants. But that when you say yes, some things fall into place in a way that really, really matters. and matters in a way that we don't even get to see all of in this life.